Welcome back to Anime Lockdown. I have with me returning champions, their third Anime Lockdown in a row, NoS Anime, with the history of Mecha, the 80s. Welcome back.
Thanks so much, JP. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel. We are NoS Anime. Now, we're a Florida-based panel group dedicated to bringing high-quality, well-researched, and informative panels to conventions. Today, we're here to present you the second in a series of panels focused on the history of one of anime's most renowned genres, Mecha. Now, for the members of our group, the Mecha genre is foundational to our love of anime. The centrality of Mecha within our fandom experience piqued our interest in how such a genre came to exist within our modern world. This curiosity led us to the idea of this panel series as a way to convey the historical developments of the Mecha genre over the decades. While our first panel covered the initial 2 decades of the 60s and 70s with the slew of developments therein, for this second iteration, we go to the formative days of the 1980s. This was where some of Mecha's most famous franchises arose or came into their own, and along the way, the genre experienced the boon that would come from technological transpiration and economic expansion. In order to present this to you, we'll be highlighting the rapidly expanding and changing Mecha genre over the course of this infamous decade by way of some of its most notable series, OVAs, and movies. Now, unlike the 60s and 70s, the 80s doesn't lend itself to a clear or concise chronological development of the genre. The rapidity of development and the overlap of change mean that while we're going to do our best to stick with a fairly sequential experience, things won't be as rigid as before. And again, just as with our previous iteration, the presentation will not merely be a list of shows and dates. Nothing in a culture exists within a vacuum, so throughout the panel, we'll also highlight the various historical, economical, and societal factors that played a role in shaping mecha anime during the decade. By the time we finish, you should have a pretty good understanding of how the 80s shepherded the mecha genre into what many describe as its golden age. Now, keep in mind, the abundance of mecha in this period will inevitably mean that some famous programs will be left out, and despite our intentions, we aren't going to be able to cover the important effect mecha was having on anime consumption internationally. Now, we do have some time set aside at the end for questions, so we'll take those from the chat once that finishes up. But before we get into anything else, we do want to start by briefly reiterating mecha as a term and how we'll define it for the purposes of this presentation. So mecha is merely a Japanese abbreviation for mechanical that refers to all mechanical things. In anime, this meaning tends to be limited to advanced vehicles and robots, and even then, the robots are broken up between smaller, autonomous robots all the way to giant robots. For our panel series, we're looking at mecha purely from the perspective of giant robots. And there are 3 determinant factors for defining what we mean when we say mecha. Now, the first of these is size. The mecha must be bigger than a man. Second is that the robot, in some way, shape, or form, is dependent upon a person to function in whatever capacity it's intended for, be it combat, construction, what have you. And finally, a giant robot must feature prominently in the show, so as to prevent homage, episodic adventures, and spoofs from veering us off course. Now, this isn't a perfect system, but it is necessary to give us a baseline from which our discussion can stem and parameters within which to work. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the history of the period itself. Now, as a brief recap, Japan's history in the 60s and 70s was the story of its consolidation as a capitalist bulwark in East Asia against the rising menace of communism. International policy was minimal, with national defense being left essentially in the hands of the US, which allowed for one of the most monumental economic recoveries in history. Coming into the 1980s, the Japanese economy was technically growing slower than it had in the 70s, but when placed against the economies of other first world nation states, even this retarded growth was dominant. Now, this burgeoning hegemony stemmed not only from the US-Japan defensive alliance, but also the tacit approval the US gave to Japan's manipulation of the rate of the yen to the dollar. The primary result of this was that Japan's economy was heavily export-driven, as the artificially lowered exchange rate allowed Japan's exports to beat out their competitors, and profits from those exports were siphoned into increasing the ability to export more goods. In America, Japan's greatest trading partner, Japanese competition was proving debilitating to important facets of American industry, such as the auto industry. This unfair comparison, as it was seen, led to a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the US that's well documented in the 80s, with a lot of scenes of people destroying Japanese goods up to and including US congressmen. As far as the US was concerned, something had to be done. Now, these economic concerns came to a head with the Plaza Accords of September of 1985, which limited Japan's ability to control the yen as closely and moved it to a more standard floating rate. The result of this was that the exchange rate moved starkly, and it caused a recession in Japan in 1986. The Japanese solution to this would usher in the beginning of the infamous bubble economy. So the decision was made to bolster the economy with a drastic lowering of interest rates and the printing of money. The effect of the former was to provide supplemental cash for Japanese businesses to make up for those lost export profits, and the latter kept the yen at a low rate relative to the dollar. The end result was that the Plaza Accords' goal of tipping the trade balance in America's favor didn't end up working as intended. But with companies flush with easily available cash, investing purely in increasing exports was no longer the only viable option. And companies soon settled in on investing in a finite resource that was always desirable: land. Now, business investment in commercial property caused a booming real estate market, which, for peculiarities we're not going to get into, meant that Japan's stock market became inexorably linked to land value. All the while, mind you, the Liberal Democratic Party that dominated Japanese politics and the ever-present Japanese bureaucracy, which had always worked in tandem to steer the economy to success, began to stagnate under weak leadership rocked by scandal after scandal. The consequence of this will become all the more apparent when we get to the 90s. So where do we stand at the end of the 1980s? So the major industries of Japan are flush with cash, still dominating global trade, and participating in a runaway real estate bull market. While anime doesn't play a direct role here at all, the consequence of all this is that money flowed everywhere in Japan. People had ample funds to buy secondary goods, which meant that niche industries like anime were able to flourish. And on top of this, we can't forget that Japan continued to stay out of the game of international politics. So all the shenanigans involved in the collapsing of the Soviet Union, for example, that was just a blip on the radar as Japan continued their rise to economic glory. War and conflict were, however, ever present in the primary focus of this panel: mecha anime. Now, in the course of the previous decades, mecha anime had started with relatively benign depictions of conflict, with the likes of Tetsujin 28 Go. Now, this made sense for the time, as these shows were not meant to be particularly deep, but vehicles by which outside sponsoring companies made sales of their merchandise. The early 70s brought about the advent of the zinc alloy die-cast toys, which revolutionized the monetization of mecha anime and made the toys of a show integral to their success. As the 70s rolled along, toy manufacturers and their corresponding anime became invariably more intertwined. Now, this symbiotic relationship between mecha anime and toy companies led to a blossoming of innovation in the late 70s, when it became apparent to creators that, as long as your robot fought once an episode to advertise the toys, the story itself could be almost anything. This freedom in storytelling led to more complex plots, themes, and characters in mecha, and the scene was ripe for a truly groundbreaking series. The show that would take all the innovations of the 70s to their zenith would be one with an innovative method of depicting war and even the giant robots themselves: Mobile Suit Gundam. Set in mankind's distant future in a timeline known as the Universal Century, Mobile Suit Gundam tells the story of a rebellious nation of space colonists known as the Principality of Zeon that uses its superior mobile suit weapons to attempt to defeat the Earth Federation and conquer the entirety of the Earth sphere. 7 months into the war on a remote space colony, the Federation's first mobile suits and their carrier ship come under attack by Zeon, forcing a teenager, Amuro Ray, to pilot the prototype combat mobile suit Gundam and become integral to the fate of the entire war. So, Gundam, a creation of Yoshiyuki Tomino, is where we left off for part 1 of this series, and at the time, things were not looking up. Poor ratings and lackluster toy sales led to the major sponsor canceling its partnership, and it doomed the production. At the time, it seemed like Gundam may not make it much past there. But the 80s would see a reversal in Gundam's fortune, with 2 major factors working in its favor. The first was the existence of anime magazines, clubs, etc., that represented the development of a singular anime fandom. These magazines dug deeper into examinations of anime as an art form, and changed the largely ephemeral existence of TV anime into something more concrete. Clubs and other organizations spread the word of shows like Gundam, which, with its more mature themes and depictions of war, which led to great success in Gundam's reruns. Despite its cancellation, Gundam was a fixation in this burgeoning anime community. The second factor tapped into this lingering interest and helped Gundam to come back in force. This was the entrance of the Bandai Toy Company onto the stage with plastic models of the robots and ships from the Gundam series. The mere fact that Bandai decided to bring out something Gundam-related is quite surprising. For all the favor Gundam had garnered with anime fans, it was still a commercial failure. Bandai, however, had seen great success with models of the Yamato from Space Battleship Yamato, and they were hoping to take advantage of the similar furor surrounding Gundam. As a result, Bandai put out 1/144th scale models of some of Gundam's most famous protagonist and antagonist ships, plus some of the titular Gundam and Zaku mobile suits. Now, the very affordable price of these models, 300 yen for the mobile suits, made them a roaring success. And these models, with their military scale and customizability, played well to the people who found Gundam and its new real robot aesthetic to be enticing. The success of these models helped to propel Gundam back to life with the creation of 3 compilation films. Now, these films recut the original series, cleaning up the original story and eliminating some of the lingering super robot features which had been thrust onto the production to help with the toy sales. And the films were very well received, and Gundam was propelled further into the public sphere. At this time, a lot of younger kids who hadn't much gotten into Gundam now dove headlong into it, and the models became only more popular. So Gundam was now something that not only resonated with anime fandom proper, but more broadly with Japanese youth. Unlike at the end of our previous decade, there was no longer any concern that Gundam would just be a footnote in history, though it certainly wasn't the franchise that we know today. Not yet. Now, Gundam's greatest effect on the history of mecha anime was to split off the real robot subgenre of mecha from its super robot predecessors, and set the groundwork for a boom in real robot anime in the coming years. We should note, however, that in the first few years of the decade, the real robot subgenre was coming into its own, and things were business as usual for other mecha shows. Those which existed alongside Gundam during the early portion of 1980 and into its renaissance in 1981, for example, included classic super robot productions like Invincible Robo Trider G7 and Godmars. 1980 in particular was also the first year that mecha anime would see a return to its originator in the form of the remake of Tetsujin 28 Go, creatively named Shin Tetsujin 28 Go. At the same time, however, real robot anime was starting to coalesce from Gundam's innovation. Tomino's immediate project after Gundam was one that really tiptoed the line between what would, and very little time afterwards, solidify into the distinct subgenres. This show is Space Runaway Ideon. Set in the distant future where humanity is colonizing other worlds, archaeologists on the planet Solo in the Andromeda Galaxy discover a ship and the combining giant robot Ideon. Almost as soon as they discover Ideon, the group is attacked by aliens known as the Buff Clan, who are after the mysterious id energy that powers the robot. So if this series were to come out today, it would undoubtedly be classified as a super robot show. But in the context of the genre divide Mecha was going through, things become less clear. The tenor of the conflict between Ideon's handlers and the Buff Clan is more reminiscent of Gundam's handling of warfare, and early on, the Ideon has a more real robot feel to it. It's only later, as the human crew of the Ideon get more adept at using the robot and its id energy source, does it really dive into super robot territory full out. Alongside Ideon is another show that towed the line between these subgenres, and this was Space Warrior Baldios. While Baldios had more of a classic super robot feel when it came to the titular mecha, its plot was distinctly hard sci-fi, such as in Gundam, and it showcased the latter series' propensity for incredible amounts of human trauma and devastation. Now, the story of these series' production and their final fate is where they become really important to us. Both series failed to attract audiences in ratings and in the ever-important toy sales, which caused them to be cancelled prematurely. Both of them would finish out their plot lines in later feature films. Now, both series still involved production committees with toy companies, but producers' confidence in the directors of each project as auteurs had proved a bit misguided. The failure of these series is seen in the industry as a failure of merchandising consideration relative to content. But unlike Gundam, the films to finish up these series came about much quicker. They, unlike Gundam, didn't have any sort of revolutionary toy come to save them, but rather they tapped into the continuing power of anime fandom. Films, you see, didn't have to be as successful in the realm of toy merchandise, because for films at the time, pre-sales of tickets and higher-end related goods like soundtracks were more integral to their success. Producers recognized that, while these anime couldn't cut it as TV shows, they could still tap into the higher spending power of anime fans to bring them to a successful conclusion. But no longer would you see TV series which sacrifice so much in the way of merchandise potential to the whims of their directors. Now, as we continue into the 1980s, we run into the first show that would truly take all of Gundam's innovations to heart and become the next purely real robot anime, Fang of the Sun Dougram. So on the colony planet Deloyer, the citizens are calling for their independence from the Earth Federation. After the planet's governor initiates a coup and gains Federation backing, his own estranged son, Kryn Kasham, part of a rebel group known as Fang of the Sun, pilots the prototype combat armor Dougram to fight for freedom. So this show is a product of the well-known mecha directors Ryosuke Takahashi and Takeyuki Kanda. And Dougram is the first time someone other than Tomino really got the whole real robot thing right. There was no flippancy when it came to whether or not this was a hard sci-fi robot show. Dougram actually showed their robots being built in factories, and took the military robot concept further by eliminating the robot's face for a cockpit designed to look like that of a helicopter. This design concept was envisioned and realized by Gundam's mechanical designer, Kunio Akawara, after the toy company Takara decided to cash in on Bandai's Gundam model success. It was only after Takara and Akawara had completed the design of the titular Dougram combat armor that the directors came in. So it was the marketability of Dougram's mecha that was important to consider prior to getting the actual show together, since its model sales would be paramount to its success. Luckily for Dougram, the directors they chose embraced what was going on with the concept. Honda was knowledgeable about military kit, for example, and so helped Dougram with the types of considerations that made it a success with fans wanting a more realistic bent to their mecha. And Takahashi also embraced the real robot aesthetic in his own way. He knew that as long as the model sold well, he could do what he wanted with the story, and his solution to making the toys do well was to encourage diorama creators showing mecha to be weathered or damaged. And this was one of Kanda's reasonings behind the first shot of Dougram, seen here, with the dilapidated robot. After all was said and done, Dougram proved to be a great success, and it really helped to solidify the concept of real robot mecha anime as something that would continue on into the future, instead of just being a creative dead end. By the time Dougram finished airing in 1983, mecha anime was in the inaugural years of its 1980s glory days. This period between 1982 and 1985 would see a vast array of mecha anime series being produced, with real robot anime in particular coming into its own as a diverse subgenre. Now, there are way too many shows in this period to go through all of them, but we do want to touch on a few that represent notable facets of this heyday and finish with one of particular note. We'll go ahead and start with combat mecha Xabungle. On the planet Zola, Jiron Amos is out to avenge the death of his parents at the hands of a mecha pilot called the Breaker. After he's found by a local bandit group called the Sand Rats, he wrangles them into his plan to steal a top-of-the-line walker machine, the Xabungle, from a local merchant in order to achieve his revenge. Now, Xabungle isn't necessarily a show filled with groundbreaking new ideas, but rather one that gives a good indication of the kind of freedom being seen on the creative side. Xabungle is essentially a mecha western at its core, which eventually expands beyond this initial small scale to encompass a planet-wide rebellion. And of all the environments that you could base a Japanese robot cartoon setting on, a glorification of the American West certainly seems like a bit of an odd duck. But that's one of the fundamental components of this period in mecha anime's history. Mecha was experiencing such prevalence during this time that unique settings which wouldn't have flown even a few years before could carry an entire series. On top of this, we also have to consider the artist behind its creation. This was a show by Yoshiyuki Tomino, whose 2 previous series had failed so spectacularly as to be cancelled before their runtime ended. But as we've seen, this wasn't just a regular time in mecha's history. Despite the initial collapse of these previous shows, both had been able to achieve financial success in the end. Such were the glory days of mecha anime that even with setbacks, a creator like Tomino could be given the opportunity to come in and generate another completely unique real robot anime for television with ample artistic freedom. And as a matter of fact, the next show we want to touch on is another Tomino creation, Aura Battler Dunbine. Following a motorcycle accident, Shozama is transported to the mystical world of Byston Well, where he and other Earthlings are recruited to pilot fantastical mecha called Aura Battlers. So in a decade where there are many innovations but few firsts, Aura Battler Dunbine stands out as one of the latter. Dunbine pioneered a unique kind of real robot anime that exists to this day. That's the fantasy real robot. The Dunbine is set in a classical fantasy setting with multiple races, knights, and magic. But into this world, Earth technology has shown up, and as a result, the mystical and the modern mix together to create a hybrid in the form of ships and fighting robots. Just like in other real robot shows, however, the mecha are still limited by practical considerations, damage, ammo capacity, transportation, that sort of thing. Even the pilot's aura for fighting effectively in the giant robots is treated as a realistic necessity rather than some special quirk that the Aura Battler pilots just happen to have. Playing into the same theme is the design of the robots, which all look like various kinds of oversized insectoid creatures, and this proved to be a key factor for Dunbine's success. The collecting and battling of bugs is one of those quintessential activities for Japanese kids, and as a result, the toys appealed to both younger kids and to older folks who appreciated the reference and the unique look of the robots for modeling. The success of the series' toys and models, plus the positive critical response, meant that Dunbine and the fantasy real robot subgenre that it pioneered would last beyond this experimental stage. And now we're going to dip back to Ryosuke Takahashi and team to go to our next mecha series we want to highlight with Armored Trooper Votoms. So though the 100-year war that tore apart the galaxy has ended, conflict is still central to the life of ex-Special Forces mecha pilot Chiriko Kuvi. Having participated in a secret mission against his own military at the end of the war, he now lives his life on the run as he tries to figure out the mystery behind what led him to this existence. Now, what immediately strikes you with Votoms is the setting. It differs from a lot of its predecessors in that it doesn't take place during the big defining war of its timeline, but rather afterwards. Additionally, while the producers were happy with the success of Dougram, they felt that its locations were a bit bland. As a result, Takahashi decided to take advantage of the chase theme behind the plot and introduce a diverse range of settings into which the story could take place. At any time, you could find Chiriko engaging in arena mecha combat in a dilapidated futuristic city, or on the run in an immense swampy jungle. Beyond the setting, however, Votoms is important to consider due to its tone. While real robot anime had inherently forced the tenor of its shows to a more serious bent compared to their super robot predecessors, Votoms takes this to its own level. It's hard to get much more grim and gritty than what Votoms has to offer. Given that the aforementioned war had ravaged the galaxy, lawlessness runs rampant in the first world that Chiriko is thrust into, and from then on you get war-torn jungle, ravaged hellscape planet, etc. Add to the fact that the authoritarian regimes of the major powers in the show are like comically cruel and corrupt, and you get an idea of just how brutal this show can be. And together with this structural brutality, there's also ample hard sci-fi, with the mecha, which Kunio Akawara designed together with input from Takahashi. The inspiration for the titular Scope Dog armored trooper from the show came from Takahashi's experience of seeing lots of surplus US military jeeps after the occupation. And both Takahashi and Akawara wanted a distinct, heavy military equipment for combat feel based on these things they experienced as children. So the resulting mecha replaced a lot of the pizzazz and color that you associate with mecha shows for a much more subdued, mass-produced look. And the final little anecdote that really displays Votom's unique place in robot anime up to this point comes from its name in relation to its mecha. While all other shows before it had a name which referenced the titular robot or ship of the series for marketing effect, Votoms is instead the name for an in-universe acronym for the show's robots and their pilots. Though a seemingly small matter, this change from 20 years of tradition up to this point really highlights the amount of confidence that the creators had in the show's ability to be successful without this previously orthodox marketing ploy. But all of these new kids on the block of all of them, one show in particular stands out with its monumental success generating the second true real robot franchise, Super Dimension Fortress Macross. In 1999, a massive alien ship appears on the Earth and reveals the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations to the world. After reverse engineering the ship's technology, 20 years later, the refitted and newly dubbed Macross prepared to embark on its maiden voyage, only to encounter an alien race, the Zentradi, and cause the outbreak of war between them and mankind. Macross was an unmitigated triumph and the cornerstone for early 80s mecha for a number of reasons that are important to us in this exercise. One important factor to consider are the creators and the production staff. This was the first major mecha anime that would see most of the primary roles in the production filled with members of the previous generation that had grown up with TV anime. As a result, a lot of the features that would come to define the subsequent Macross franchise had developed out of the minds of those already enamored with anime as an artistic influence. The creator and mechanical designer of the series, Shoji Kawamori, was only 23 years old when he developed the idea of the titular robot the series titular Valkyrie robot. Another famous member of the production, Ichiro Itano, participated heavily in animating the show's action sequences, and as a result, not only set the general tone for how fighting would look across Macross, but well beyond into mecha in general. And it was the core contingent of mecha with their high-speed action that proved to be a massive boon to the series' enduring popularity. The original idea that led to the development of the Valkyrie came about as part of Shoji Kawamori's contest with another designer for a new kind of giant robot. The key feature of this prototype design would be the backwards-facing knees, which became part of the middle transformation sequence of the protagonist's robots, and this was called the Gerwalk mode. And these robots took inspiration from the state-of-the-art F-14 Tomcat fighter, and the mecha could transform between a full robot, their Gerwalk form, and a fighter mode. This design coincided with developments in children's toys at the time, which began seeing a lot more transformable options coming out, and so it was really popular as a result. Additionally, the modeling community also looked favorably on the designs, which offered a lot of fun options for setup with a wide variety of modes, plus the distinctive look of the enemy mecha. But there was one idea that Macross settled upon that would really make it stand out amongst its peers. That's the combination of mecha, music, and girls. In this same time where mecha anime was experiencing its glory days, idols as we know them today were in their infancy and were gaining popularity. In addition to this, one of the other popular motifs in anime was a particular style of pretty girl who served as anime eye candy for the now entrenched older crowd. Macross took this popularity of idol music and mixed it into the show with a love triangle involving the main Mecha pilot, a Macross officer, and an idol singer. And this accomplished two major things for Macross. Firstly, the addition of romantic elements as core to the show's plot broadened the viewer base of Macross and made it desirable outside the realm of those interested in hard sci-fi. Secondly, this kind of popularity meant that Macross wasn't as limited in its monetary potential. With the emphasis on music and girls along with the wider viewer base, more secondary goods like soundtracks and character goods added to the already successful toy and model revenue. At the same time that Macross was making waves in the mecha community, though, another broad technological innovation would be gearing up to change anime forever, and mecha anime would be central to its story. We'll now take a dive into the evolution of personal home media and the OVA. So the early 80s saw the spread of a new kind of technology in Japan and across the world. These devices provided individual recordings of shows and films to people, with the ultimate goal of allowing them to view them however many times they wanted and at their discretion. Additionally, with the right equipment, it was possible to record broadcasts of shows as they aired on TV for later viewing. And this technology was revolutionary for anime as a form of entertainment for a couple of important reasons. The first and earlier of these reasons was that it allowed for better assessment of anime as an art form. With home video options, people could watch shows or even individual scenes over and over again to examine a theme of storytelling or to even break down animation on a frame-by-frame basis. With this ability for artistic examination now available to the masses, anime was no longer relegated to being an ephemeral and fleeting experience for the viewer. This confluence of technology with the aging of anime fans was one of the factors behind the emergence of the distinctive anime fandom that we've referenced before. But this change in anime criticism wasn't enough to actually alter how anime was created. For that, we must look to the other way in which home media revolutionized anime, and that's monetizing anime itself. Before this technology existed, anime was able to exist because its production promoted the sale of tangentially related goods, like candy or toys. Because the show itself just aired on television, it couldn't make money in and of itself as a piece of art. Personal media changed this. Home media options meant that one could enjoy an anime on TV and then go out to buy or rent a copy for themselves. The production committees now had a new source of revenue to take into consideration when creating a program that involved the actual show as something to be monetized. You can see an early example of this with the show Giant Gorg. The producers felt that it lacked in merchandising potential, and as a result, they delayed the airing of the show so that its VHS tapes could be released simultaneously with it airing on TV. So here we see a situation wherein the anime itself as a product was hopefully going to make up for failings in other sources of its revenue. But this innovation of technology now only became one of the numerous monetization considerations that went into anime production. This change, however, led people to pose a new question. What if, instead of being something designed to sell other products, anime itself was the product? Now, this had already to some extent been the idea behind anime films, but even then, all the additional costs of a feature-length production, your distribution, advertising, etc., meant that a production committee would still need to be gathered. The ultimate answer to this question would be the creation of the OVA, standing for Original Video Animation. Tellingly, the first ever OVA to be released would be a mecha anime, Dalos. So set on the moon in a future where Earth has been ravaged, the Earth federal government has, for generations, mistreated the colonists on the moon. A young colonist, Shun Nomonura, joins a rebellion against their oppressors, centered around a strange face on the moon considered sacred by the colonists, called Dalos. So while Dallos does represent a rare first for this decade, it would be wrong to think of it as a groundbreaking achievement. Even to its creators, Dallos' release was just something done to recoup the losses they had incurred after the plan for a 52-episode series had fallen through. On top of this, Dallas' whole distribution was a big old botched mess, with the second episode coming out a month before the first due to a mix-up. And as it covers only a portion of the story instead of the whole thing, Dallas also ended up not standing up well to critical analysis. Well, with a start this bad, it makes you wonder just how OVAs really got off the ground. Well, luckily for them, producers soon began to see the merits of this kind of product. This epiphany, however, was not based on anything particularly wholesome. Pornographic anime released as OVA would be the real sellers in the early period of OVAs that kept the idea going, and having viewed their success, more folks began to think about these types of releases as something that could tap into niche markets. So, if an idea came about that wouldn't make more sense in the conservative milieu of TV programs, or didn't have the mass appeal required for a film production, a small, concerted effort by a studio into an OVA proved to be the perfect match. This anime itself, sold to individuals or to rental stores, was the primary method for monetization. And for the studios, OVAs gave staff in whom they saw potential a chance to try their hand at helming portions of a production. The boom of OVAs in the 80s saw a wide variety of themes explored, and Mecha was no different. Mecha OVAs covered a wide variety of stories, such as Megazone 23, with its play on Japan in the 1980s with the fear of biker gangs. Lita, The Fantastic Adventures of Yoko, with its mix of mecha, fantasy, and pretty girls. And even classic space opera with projects like 5-Star Stories. And OVAs weren't merely relegated to independent properties. For a successful mecha series like Votoms, OVAs provided for the creators to come back and play around further with the property without the ostentatious demands that would be required for a new TV series. And the way in which OVAs made their final mark on the mecha genre gives us a really good opportunity to get back into the chronological timeframe of the 80s as we explore the petering out of mecha's boom time in 1985. And there were 4 mecha anime TV shows that would air that year, and half of those would end in the same way, by getting cancelled. These anime in question were Blue Comet SPT Leisner and Super Bestial Machine God Dankuga. At that time, neither of these entries was successful in their toy or model sales, and this doomed them. Now, as we saw previously, if your mecha show got cancelled, there was always the option to clean up things with a final film or two and glean what revenue you could. But as we've noted, film comes with a lot of extra costs. Into this steps the OVA with a new option for the producers. OVAs fulfilled the same function of the feature film by having anime be the central product, but sold at a massively reduced cost. Henceforth, both SPT Leisner and Dan Cougar would still get to finish their stories. But instead of doing so with the pomp and circumstance of the big screen, they were forced to do so in a humbler state in the home of individual fans via the OVA. But it's not that there weren't shining stars amongst the 1985 entries. One of those shows would be a major critical success, though it does help to highlight the major changes in the anime industry that led to Mecha's nadir in the late 80s. This show is Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam. Set in UC 0087, 7 years after the end of the One-Year War, a special Federation group called the Titans are tasked with preventing the resurgence of rebellion in space. Resistance against the Titans' brutal tactics coalesces around the AUG organization, which includes members from the colonies and the Earth Federation itself. In an attempt to get information on the Titans' new Gundam models, an AUG mission is launched and ends up drawing a teenager, Camille Bidan, into the conflict. Zeta Gundam here was Mobile Suit Gundam's direct sequel, and the first new Gundam anime property in 3 years. In a practical sense, Zeta did very well. The decision by its creators to incorporate the popularity of transforming robots a la Macross, together with a new main mechanical designer, allowed for Gundam's ever-important model sales to maintain a solid hold in the market. Additionally, the show itself performed well in the ratings and was received well by critics. With this in mind, you would think all the talk around Zeta would be positive, but it actually wasn't. A lot of established fans were taken aback by Zeta, as Tomino had, at one time, stated he would not do a sequel to Gundam. Anime creators had already dealt with this same sort of backlash with the space battleship Yamato films that had been released as alternate retellings of the original property. What we see in this discourse, however, is a change by the production houses as to what was needed for success. The youth who became early anime fandom were starting to get to the age where cost of living expenses now outweighed their ability to spend on things related to their favorite shows. The thought was that, to keep these fans interested and utilizing their purchasing power, it was necessary to refer back to their comfort zones instead of forcing them to absorb a new franchise. And despite some outcry, those producing anime ended up being kind of right. By the time 1986 rolled around, there would only be one Mecha Anime TV series that aired during the year, Mobile Suit Gundam Double Zeta, and everything else would be OVAs or films. Moving forward into 1987, there was an all-new Mecha Anime intellectual property that debuted on TV in the form of Metal Armor Dragonar, but it would do more to prove the concerns of producers rather than to assuage their fears. Now, Dragonar did do well with toy sales, model sales, and in the ratings, but it didn't match the goals set for it by its creators, and it would henceforth remain but a single series. Now, looking back, unlike in past years wherein you could find multiple studios doing big mecha projects, by this point it's pretty much just Sunrise doing all the work. Where, one might ask, have all the other studios gone? Well, there were two main routes that those other groups had taken. The first was to move into co-production with American projects, such as Takara did with the omnipresent Transformers franchise. Now, this franchise and series like it don't fall under the purview of this panel because of an important facet to their storytelling, the addition of sentience to the robots. Now, this key difference between Japanese mecha anime and those created initially for export was a result of the American market's interest in having robots more akin to Japanese superheroes, which sold well stateside. But there were also domestic factors encroaching on mecha's popularity. Mecha anime in the late 80s was having to compete against a new and rising competitor in the form of anime based around Shonen Jump titles. Shows like Dragon Ball and Saint Seiya were quickly becoming favorites amongst the young male demographic that had been the lifeblood of mecha fandom. Additionally, programs in the kids in armor genre like Saint Seiya also had further appeal outside their core demographic because of the presence of so many pretty boys. This gave them a leg up in monetization power compared to mecha anime that came out alongside them. So to help drive home the point here, consider that Dragonar was placed in a time slot with the Nagoya Broadcasting Network that had been reserved exclusively for mecha since Zambot 3 in 1977. After Dragonar, the next show that aired in the time slot would be Legendary Armor Samurai Troopers. And if 1987 wasn't a good year for mecha anime on TV, 1988 certainly didn't fare much better, as there were exactly 0 new mecha TV shows that aired that year. But it is here in the last 2 years of our decade where we start to see things ramping back up to bring mecha out of the late 80s slump. The smaller production OVAs and limited release films that had kept mecha afloat as a genre were now joined by the undisputed leader of mecha franchises, with Gundam's first foray into these spheres. The first of these was Gundam's first original feature-length film in the form of Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack. This performed well at the box office and generated extremely successful toy and model sales. While a unique step for Gundam, it was still written and directed by Yoshiyuki Tomino, and henceforth it kept to the main through line presented all the way back to the original series. When Gundam decided to wade into the OVA market, though, they took a different approach, with Mobile Suit Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket. Now, compared to big-budget TV shows, OVAs were looked upon by this time as the territory of the auteur, where they could experiment with designs or broach new ideas. Gundam 0080 did the same thing here, by bringing in new screenwriters, mechanical designers, and for the first time for Gundam, a director other than Tomino. And just like with Char's counterattack, the experiment proved successful, with Gundam 0080 gaining critical acclaim that it holds to this day. But while these ventures shined a light on the mecha genre once more, they were not wholly unique properties. It was to be a pair of new OVAs that would really bring mecha anime out of the doldrums and back into the foreground of anime production. The first of these is Aim for the Top Gunbuster. With Earth faced against an alien race bent on the destruction of humanity, Noriko Takaya enters a school for mecha pilots in Okinawa. Though she struggles through training, Noriko is determined to join the school's ace, Kazumi Amano, and join the fight to protect Earth. Gunbuster here was a desperately needed injection of spirit into a rather dismal time in mecha anime's history. Directed by Hideaki Anno, Gunbuster was an eclectic mix of real robot hard sci-fi, super robot flamboyance, and pretty anime girls with the bravery to shun pants. The plot was also very diverse over its 6-episode run, starting with something more akin to a sports anime and finishing with over-the-top space battles and giant robots with time travel. Now, this might seem a bit schizophrenic, but Gunbuster was more than mere eye candy, and it also dug into the personal struggles of its characters and the incomprehensible experience they had in what amounts to fighting across time itself. What all these seemingly disparate elements achieved was a broad audience appeal and a sense of exuberance that had been lacking in mecha OVAs in the previous years. One of the failings of the mecha OVA and OVAs in general during the late 80s was the same notion of the auteur that we've described. In this booming period of the Japanese economy, OVAs were so relatively simple to produce with so little return required that creators could get more and more niche in their productions. This is why, for example, the late 80s is littered with so many forgotten OVAs, including a number of mecha-related ones, like Makyo Gaiden Ladeus, Metal Skin Panic Maddox 01, and Relic Armor Legacia. So when Gunbuster came smashing into the OVA scene with its combination of popular elements and underlying soul, it really made waves. It showed the anime community that one didn't have to sacrifice the core principles of a production for it to be popular, but rather those elements could be part and parcel to it. But in apposition to Gunbuster in time, though opposition in theme, we have the final mecha property with which we'll close out the decade, Mobile Police Patlabor. In the future, advancement in technology leads to the development of construction robots known as labors. In order to combat the inevitable threat of crimes involving labors, Tokyo Metropolitan Police establishes the Special Vehicles Division with police labor units known as Patlabors. The story unfolds as new mecha pilot Noah Izumi joins the rowdy cast of characters that make up Special Vehicles 2nd Division, or SV2. Now, compared against the boldness of Gunbuster, Patlabor was certainly a much more subdued affair, but one dripping with charm and rife with potential. The creator's vision for Patlabor was something that would be properly real robot without the overbearing setting of a war that inevitably weighed a show down with gravitas. And this is what the show became. The careful considerations of the practical nature of a bunch of robots running around in a congested city gave it a distinct feel, with a down-to-earth character that other real robot shows couldn't always match. In addition to the technology, it was also very important to the creators to focus the attention on the livelihoods of the team tasked with manning these machines. And to add some levity to the genre, the members of SV2 were an endearing bunch of goofballs, including the main character, Noah, with her otaku-like love for her giant robot. The result of these technical and character considerations made Patlabor feel more grounded than many of its predecessors, and gave it a more general allure than other mecha projects. And this popularity that Patlabor engendered was enough to get it greenlit for new projects. But with both Patlabor and Gunbuster proving successful in the same time period, why, one might ask, was Patlabor the only one to immediately result in a variety of sequels? It's in answering this question that we highlight Patlabor's other strengths that would drive it to success. While Gunbuster and Patlabor both had wide appeal, the breadth of that appeal reached different ranges of the population. Gunbuster's unique selling points still heavily targeted the anime fan demographic, with its hard sci-fi and particular method of depicting female characters. Patlabor had the technical know-how, but in place of girls acting as selling points, it used its ensemble cast and their range of quirks to keep the viewer interested. Additionally, the setting of the show in Tokyo of the near future meant that the scenery and atmosphere were much more familiar compared to the futuristic Gunbuster. This all added up to a program which drew an anime fandom, but at the same time gave producers something more conservative in which they saw more mass market appeal. And the final icing on the cake was with Patlabor's story. The 7-episode OVA included a diverse range of plot elements, including everyday police shenanigans, a kaiju encounter, and even Hollywood-style political intrigue. For those looking to embrace Patlabor's success, it provided a great opportunity to diversify. The critically well-received political intrigue phase of Patlabor would be taken to a new level in the first of the successor ventures, Patlabor the Movie. Directed by Mamoru Oshii, who had directed the initial project, the film built upon the timeline of the original and debuted a new case of SV2 coming to the rescue of Tokyo. Patlabor's other, more sitcom-style face would be co-opted for the TV series. And it would be this televised program, debuting on October 11th, 1989, that helped to cement Patlabor's legacy. Save a single show that debuted earlier that year targeting a very young child demographic, Patlabor had really been in the television doghouse for the better part of 2 years. This new Patlabor show was a welcome return to form for Mecha as we finish out the decade. Fans at the time, however, couldn't know whether this Patlabor project would represent a new renaissance for Mecha on TV or merely be the last gasp of a dying breed. And this is where we're forced to leave off as the 90s loom on the horizon. As we've looked back at mecha anime over the course of the decade, what we hope you've seen is a much more nuanced picture of the highs and lows that the genre experienced compared to the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia. The 80s were undoubtedly a magnificent time for mecha, with more than 100 different entries in the genre created over the course of the decade. And mecha was not only prolific, but also incredibly diverse, as the genre divide perpetrated by Gundam opened up new avenues for creative storytelling and merchandising to support productions. This, combined with the continued stability offered by the export-driven Japanese economy, made the early part of the decade a boom time for mecha anime. But this time was not to last. By 1986, as the country was dealing with the hiccup caused by the Plaza Accords, mecha anime too experienced a recession. While this could have devastated it in a previous age, technological advancements in home media spawned the OVA, which would help to stabilize the wavering genre. Consequently, as Japan dove headlong into the throngs of the bubble economy, so too would established franchises and innovative OVAs begin to reinvigorate mecha as the final decade of the 20th century began. That subsequent decade of the 90s would see Japan's meteoric rise to international economic supremacy stifled by the popping of its bubble, and as we'll see next time, mecha anime would also experience its own unique combination of highs and lows. And thank you very much for joining us. If anyone is interested in following us on social media, Twitter, my Twitter, NOS_anime, that's where we're most active. The Facebook is woefully underloved. For us especially, if you look for us, nosanime.tumblr.com for our Tumblr page. For this panel and our other mecha panel, we do have the list of shows that meet our criteria, also noting the particular shows mentioned in the panel. Now, we're starting to do it more with our current panels, but there's also bibliography, a brief bibliography for some of the sources we used here. For our current and later panels, we're going to be providing more full bibliographies. And shameless plug, if you like food, we do a bunch of food panels. And so there are also a bunch of anime recipes you can find on there if you wanted. But that will leave us with about 5 or so minutes. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to jump over to my other computer where I can see the Twitch stream. And if anyone has questions, I will be more than happy to try and answer them.
Probably take a second for the stream to catch up. I think there's like a 10 to 30 second delay.
All right, yeah. If y'all have any questions or anything, feel free and throw them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer.
I see one. Who is your Oshi robot? Who do you stand/ship?
Like Oshi, like Mamoru Oshi?
I assume that's who they're talking about.
Oh, then Ingram. I'm a Patlabor junkie. I love the Ingram. Do you have
Oh, they're clarifying.
preferred author for Bubble Era history? Not a single preferred author for the history of the Bubble Era. I used a huge variety of sources, everything from just reading historical books on the Japanese economy to reading stories of the post-war economic boom. I think a few of them are included in the bibliography. Like, so when we're working on the 90s one right now. It's taken us forever, but that's going to have a much more full bibliography. But there's not like a single author for the Bubble Era that I would say, oh, you definitely have to read X or Y. There's not one that just immediately comes to mind.
I believe our next panelist is writing a book on the anime bubble.
Oh, I'm talking about the real estate bubble of the late 80s into the early 90s.
Sorry. I'm half asleep. I was up very late getting things ready for the panel.
Man, you're not going to sleep anytime soon. I've seen the schedule.
Nope.
Let's see. What's your favorite mecha anime that is specifically often met with contention when you state you like it? Of the ones, let's just kind of pick from the 80s, Votoms, because a lot of, I like watching Votoms because I like old depressing mecha, and you hear people trying to start Votoms and they just get bored with it. It's slow and depressing and brooding, and so while I love it, I know that's kind of a really common commonly like not popular thing. Some questions passed by in the chat. Let's see. One second. I saw a question, but the chat keeps moving. Let's see. What's our favorite Patlabor, I think? Yes, which Patlabor title is your favorite? The first Patlabor movie is my personal favorite. I will watch it at least once a year. It's just good fun. Super well animated. I love the direction. I like the little bit of dipping into the Tower of Babel and biblical punishment and stuff that Oshi brings in. If I were a better, literary style critic of media, I feel I could do a whole panel on it, but I'm trying to get better at that, but I haven't really dug my toes into it yet. Let's see. Oh, it's this one. Yes, a question. Yes, so for this panel, we just started doing bibliographies with panels a few years back, like full bibliographies. So there is one with the sources that at the time I could remember I had used, or I had notes indicating that I had used them. So if you go on the page, on the left-hand side of the Tumblr, there's a link to the Mecha panels. One of them is a bibliography with what I could remember. When we eventually get the 90s panel, that is going to have a full works cited with everything I've been going through, the probably 100 sources. I used about the same for this one. Let's see. Are there any others? Got a couple minutes. I can probably get one more in.
Somebody asked what your favorite 80s robot or 80s title is that you did not include.
Oh, that I did not include. Oh yeah, Elgheim. It'd be Elgheim, or maybe some parts of Panzer World Gallant. I think Elgheim's generally I like more of it, but some parts of Panzer World Gallant are awesome. I love it to death. All right, well, like I said, that leaves us with a minute, so I'll go ahead and let JP lead us into the interim for the next panel. I appreciate everyone that joined us. Hope you all had a good time.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. A third year in a row, or well, I guess we took a year off in the middle there. Oh goodness, where did my Zoom window go? We're gonna be trapped in the call forever, just like an isekai. I can't find the window.
We got more panels just in case.
There we go. I found it. Okay, well, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care, JP.
Cheers.